Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. On a January morning in 1893, armed men marched through Honolulu. Not criminals, not invaders, but businessmen. Behind them stood United States Marines, rifles loaded, positioned across the capital. They claimed they were there to keep order. Inside Iolani Palace, Hawaii's queen understood exactly what that meant. If she ordered resistance, the city would burn. If she stepped aside, her country might survive long enough to argue its case. She chose restraint. By sunset, the Hawaiian government no longer ruled Hawaii. There was no vote, no treaty, no declaration of war, just a takeover engineered by a small group of men who wanted the land, the economy, and eventually the crown itself. This is not the story of how Hawaii slowly faded into the United States. It's the story of how it was taken, step by calculated step. Before it was stolen, Hawaii was not weak, isolated, or undeveloped. It was a functioning nation, modern by 19th century standards and fully recognized by the world powers of its time. The Hawaiian Kingdom had a constitution, diplomatic relations, and formal treaties with the United States and European nations. Its capital, Honolulu, was a working international port. Iolani Palace had electric lights before the White House did. This was not a primitive society awaiting guidance. It was a state that expected its sovereignty to be respected. That expectation rested on a dangerous assumption, that recognition guaranteed protection. Hawaiian leaders believed that if they followed international rules, others would do the same. They opened their ports, welcomed foreign residents, and allowed outsiders to live and work under Hawaiian law. It was a gesture of confidence, not submission. Among those welcomed were American Protestant missionaries. They arrived to preach, teach, and settle. The kingdom allowed them to buy land, build schools, and raise families. Their children were born Hawaiian citizens. Their success depended entirely on the stability of the Hawaiian state that hosted them. But prosperity changed incentives. As global demand for sugar exploded, Hawaii became economically irresistible. Sugar plantations spread across the islands, and the descendants of missionaries were perfectly positioned to control them. They owned the land, the mills, the banks, and the shipping routes. By the late 1800s, sugar was Hawaii's economy, and American planters owned it. That ownership created a realization that would drive everything that followed. These men did not need the Hawaiian monarchy. In fact, the monarchy stood in their way. Tariffs, voting laws, and royal authority threatened profits. If Hawaii remained sovereign, their wealth was never fully secure. So they stopped thinking like guests. They started thinking like owners. What made Hawaii the perfect target was not weakness. It was restraint. The kingdom believed power followed law. The men who now controlled its economy believed power followed leverage. And once they understood that difference, the plan to take Hawaii stopped being abstract. It became operational. By the 1880s, Hawaii's economy no longer belonged to its government. It belonged to sugar. And sugar belonged to a small circle of men who understood exactly how much leverage that gave them. American planters controlled the plantations, the mills, the banks that financed them, and the ships that carried sugar to California. Their profits depended on one thing above all else: unrestricted access to the U.S. market. When American tariffs threatened those profits, the planters did not lobby the Hawaiian crown to protect sovereignty. They pressured it to surrender power. Two names mattered more than any others. Lauren Thurston, a lawyer and politician born in Hawaii to missionary parents, became the movement's chief strategist. He believed openly that the Hawaiian monarchy was obsolete and that American control was inevitable. Sanford Dole, also born in the island, served as the respectable face, measured, calm, and legally fluent. Together, they gave the sugar interests something they had lacked before: a plan. Their logic was simple. As long as the Hawaiian monarch retained authority, the planters' wealth sat on unstable ground. A sovereign government could change laws, raise taxes, or challenge land claims. Annexation would solve that problem permanently. But first, the monarchy had to be neutralized. They began by reshaping politics from the inside. Thurston and his allies used their economic power to influence lawmakers, newspapers, and armed civic groups. They framed their actions as reform, warning that the monarchy threatened stability and foreign investment. Every argument pointed in the same direction. Hawaii needed modern governance, and modern in their vocabulary meant American-aligned. The planters also understood something crucial about timing. They did not need popular support. They needed control at key moments. By owning the economy, they could apply pressure without firing a shot. Workers depended on their wages. Politicians depended on their backing. The crown depended on tax revenue generated by sugar exports. This was not a spontaneous uprising or a cultural misunderstanding. It was a calculated shift in loyalty, from the Hawaiian state that had welcomed them to the American power that could secure their fortunes. The men leading this effort were not outsiders invading from abroad. They were insiders, raised under Hawaiian protection, now preparing to dismantle it. By the late 1880s, the motive was clear and the players were in position. What remained was the first decisive move, the moment when influence would turn into coercion and reform would turn into force. That moment arrived with a constitution written at gunpoint. In 1887, King Kalakaua was summoned to a meeting he did not control. Waiting for him were armed members of a white militia known as the Honolulu Rifles, men financed and organized by the sugar interests. Standing behind them was Loren Thurston, holding a document that would later be remembered by a single name, the Bayonet Constitution. Thurston and his allies did not negotiate. They issued an ultimatum. If the king refused to sign, they warned, violence would follow. The militia had rifles. The palace had guards who understood the odds. With a gun to his head, literally and politically, Kalakaua signed. The Constitution stripped the monarchy of real power in a single stroke. It transferred authority to a legislature dominated by property owners and imposed voting requirements designed to exclude Native Hawaiians while enfranchising wealthy foreigners. Citizenship no longer mattered. Land and money did. This was the moment the theft became visible. The sugar barons did not overthrow the kingdom that day. They hollowed it out. By keeping the crown intact but powerless, they preserved the appearance of continuity while ensuring control rested elsewhere. It was a coup executed through ink and intimidation. Sanford Dole defended the Constitution as lawful reform. Thurston celebrated it as necessary. Together they sold it as modernization. But the reality was simpler. The men who owned Hawaii's economy had rewritten its government to protect their assets. The Hawaiian public understood what had happened. The king had not chosen reform. He had been forced, but the damage was done. The Constitution locked the monarchy into paralysis, making future resistance far more difficult. Any attempt to reclaim authority could now be framed as unconstitutional, even though the Constitution itself had been imposed by force. From that point on, sovereignty existed largely on paper. The crown remained, ceremonies continued, and foreign diplomats still attended royal functions. But decisions that mattered, about trade, land, and political power, now flowed through institutions controlled by the very men who had engineered the crisis. The Bayonet Constitution was not the end of the plan. It was rehearsal. It proved that intimidation worked, that international norms would not intervene, and that Hawaiian restraint could be exploited without consequence. The conspirators had learned how to take power without looking like criminals. All they needed now was the right moment to finish the job. The Bayonet Constitution solved one problem and created another. It weakened the monarchy, but it did not remove it. As long as a Hawaiian sovereign still existed, the sugar elite's control was not absolute. The crown could not rule freely, but it could still become a rallying point, and that made it dangerous. When King Kalakaua died in 1891, the risk increased. His sister, Queen Liliʻuokalani, inherited a throne already stripped of power, and she understood exactly how that had happened. Unlike her brother, she did not accept the Bayonet Constitution as permanent. She treated it for what it was, a document signed under threat. Almost immediately, the men behind the 1887 coup recognized the danger. Loren Thurston resumed organizing, this time with a narrower goal. The monarchy could not simply be restrained. It had to be removed. Reform was no longer enough. Control required elimination. Thurston gathered allies from the sugar industry, foreign business leaders, and political figures tied to American interests. They called themselves the Committee of Safety, a name chosen carefully. It implied defense, not aggression. In reality, it functioned as a planning cell for overthrow. Their strategy was precise. They would provoke a crisis, frame the Queen as unstable, and request American intervention. Violence would not be spontaneous, it would be managed. The appearance of chaos would justify force, while restraint by the Queen would be used against her. At the center of this plan stood the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, John Stevens. Thurston cultivated him relentlessly, arguing that American lives and property were at risk. Stevens did not question the narrative. He accepted it. And with that acceptance, the conspirators gained something more powerful than any militia. They gained access to U.S. Marines. By late 1892, the pieces were in place. The Queen prepared to restore authority to the Crown through constitutional means. Thurston and his allies prepared to call it rebellion. The sugar elite did not wait for events to unfold. They positioned themselves to control how those events would be interpreted. This was no longer a struggle over governance. It was a countdown. The conspirators had tested intimidation, rewritten law, and neutralized resistance. The final step required only one thing: foreign force placed at the right location, at the right time. That moment came in January of 1893. On January 16, 1893, the plan moved from paper to action. At the request of Lorrin Thurston and the Committee of Safety, John Stevens ordered U.S. Marines ashore from the cruiser Boston. They marched through Honolulu and took positions around government buildings, weapons loaded, flags flying. The Marines did not fire a single shot. They did not need to. Their presence alone decided the outcome. By placing American troops between the conspirators and the Queen, Stevens ensured that any attempt by the Hawaiian government to defend itself would be portrayed as violence against the United States. Inside Iolani Palace, Queen Liliʻuokalani faced the same calculation her brother had faced years earlier. Only now the stakes were higher. The Honolulu Rifles stood ready. U.S. Marines controlled the streets. Any order to resist would turn Honolulu into a battlefield and give the conspirators the justification they wanted. She refused to give them that victory. Rather than order bloodshed, the Queen yielded authority under protest, stating clearly that she did so to avoid violence and that she trusted the United States to correct the injustice. It was a strategic decision rooted in restraint. It would later be misrepresented as surrender. Within hours, the Committee of Safety declared the Hawaiian monarchy overthrown. They did not consult voters. They did not hold a referendum. They announced a provisional government and installed Sanford Dole as its head. Dole's role was crucial. Where Thurston provided urgency and ideology, Dole provided legitimacy. He spoke the language of law and order. He framed the coup as a necessary response to instability. The presence of American troops gave those claims weight, even as they lacked consent. The Queen was placed under house arrest. The monarchy was suspended. The government of Hawaii changed hands without a single ballot being cast. The coup succeeded not because it was popular, but because it was protected. This was the moment the theft became complete. The Bayonet Constitution had crippled the crown. The coup removed it, and U.S. military force, introduced under false pretenses, ensured that no Hawaiian response could alter the outcome. The conspirators had not seized Hawaii in battle. They had taken it by controlling the rules of engagement, the narrative of order, and the presence of overwhelming power. What remained was to make the takeover permanent. The coup did not end the struggle. It shifted it to a new arena. Once the monarchy was removed, the conspirators faced a final problem. Their government had no legitimacy beyond the rifles that protected it. To survive, it needed recognition and ultimately absorption by the United States. Sanford Dole moved quickly. He declared that the provisional government existed only temporarily until Hawaii could be annexed. This was not neutrality, it was intent. The new regime did not pretend to represent the Hawaiian people. It positioned itself as a bridge to American control. Native Hawaiians responded immediately. They organized mass petitions rejecting annexation and demanding the restoration of their queen. These were not symbolic gestures. Nearly every adult Native Hawaiian signed. The message was unambiguous. The coup did not speak for the nation. In Washington, that message landed. Investigations confirmed what the petitions alleged. The overthrow had relied on unauthorized actions by John Stevens and the presence of American troops. The Queen had yielded to avoid bloodshed, not because she lacked support. For a moment, restoration seemed possible, but the conspirators understood time better than justice. While Washington debated, the provisional government entrenched itself. Laws were enforced. Opponents were marginalized. Normalcy became a weapon. Each day that passed without reversal made the coup feel less like a crime and more like a fact. When immediate annexation stalled, Dole adjusted the strategy. The provisional government declared itself the Republic of Hawaii, a state in name if not in consent. Elections were held under rules designed to exclude most Native Hawaiians. Control remained in the same hands. The form changed. The power did not. Then geopolitics intervened. As the United States moved toward war with Spain, Hawaii's value skyrocketed. The islands became a strategic necessity, a Pacific outpost that could not be left independent. In that moment, legality became inconvenient. Annexation no longer required a treaty. Congress passed a joint resolution. The unresolved questions, the coup, the petitions, the investigations, were not answered. They were bypassed. The theft was finalized not with debate, but with urgency. What had begun as a private conspiracy was now justified as national security. And once Hawaii was absorbed, reversing the act became politically unthinkable. On August 12, 1898, the transfer became visible. At Iolani Palace, officials gathered to perform what was framed as a formal ceremony. In reality, it was a funeral for a nation. As the Hawaiian flag was lowered, the royal band refused to play. People in the crowd wept openly. There was no celebration, no vote, no sense of conclusion, only the quiet recognition that something irretrievable had just occurred. When the American flag rose in its place, Hawaii did not join the United States. It was absorbed. This moment mattered because it revealed the final logic of the takeover. No treaty had been ratified by the Hawaiian people. No plebiscite had approved annexation. The flag changed because power said it would. The legality was improvised. The consent was absent. From that day forward, Hawaii was governed as a U.S. territory. Decisions about land, labor, and law were now made through American institutions, staffed largely by the same interests that had orchestrated the coup. What the conspiracy had begun, administration completed. The men who planned the overthrow were rewarded with permanence. Sanford Dole became the first territorial governor. Loren Thurston returned to business and influence. His role in the coup folded into official history as reform. The theft no longer needed guards. It had become policy. Native Hawaiians were not consulted on how their country would now be run. Their objections were recorded, archived, and ignored. The absence of rebellion was rebranded as acceptance. Silence, manufactured through exclusion, was treated as consent. This was the success of the heist. The conspirators did not need to justify what they had done forever. They needed only to make it normal. Once the flag came down, time began working in their favor. And time would be used to take more than land. Once Hawaii was absorbed, the work of consolidation began. The goal was no longer to justify the takeover, but to make it irreversible. That required more than control of government. It required control of language, land, and memory. The new territorial administration moved quickly. English replaced Hawaiian in schools and official business. Children were punished for speaking their native language in classrooms. This was not incidental. Hawaiian was the language in which history, law, and resistance had been recorded. By removing it from public life, access to the past narrowed to those who already held power. Land followed a similar path. Areas once held in trust or regarded as sacred were surveyed, divided, and sold. Plantations expanded. Military installations followed. Later, tourism would complete the transformation. Each development was legal under the new system, and each one pushed Native Hawaiians further from the land that had defined authority and obligation for generations. History itself was rewritten. Official accounts emphasized order and progress, portraying annexation as peaceful and inevitable. The petitions opposing annexation disappeared from textbooks. The coup was reframed as a transition. What had been taken by force was remembered as consent through omission. This erasure was gradual, and that made it effective. There was no single moment when Hawaiian culture vanished. Instead, public expression shrank year by year. What survived did so privately, inside families, churches, and communities that refused to let memory dissolve into policy. The theft, in other words, did not end with annexation. It continued through administration. Power was no longer exercised at gunpoint, but through regulation, school rules, and land titles. Resistance became harder to see, not because it ended, but because the space for it was deliberately narrowed. By the early 20th century, Hawaii appeared settled. The machinery of governance functioned smoothly. The men who had engineered the coup no longer needed to explain themselves. The system they built enforced the outcome automatically. What had been taken first was sovereignty. What followed was the ability to challenge the loss in public, collective ways. And once that ability was constrained, the absence of visible resistance was used to justify the story that nothing had ever been stolen at all. Time did what the conspirators expected it to do. As decades passed, the takeover of Hawaii stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a background condition. New generations grew up under American rule, taught a version of history where annexation was framed as progress, and the kingdom existed only as a prelude. But normalization did not resolve the crime, it only obscured it. Native Hawaiians never consented to the loss of their country. They adapted because survival required it, not because the outcome was accepted. Language survived in homes when it was banned in schools. Traditions persisted quietly when public expression was discouraged. Memory endured where institutions had failed. Over time, resistance resurfaced in new forms. Immersion schools reopened paths to Hawaiian language and history. Protests emerged when sacred land was threatened by development. These movements were not about nostalgia. They were about continuity, the refusal to accept that a nation could be erased simply because power declared it finished. The United States eventually acknowledged the truth it had long avoided. A century after the coup, Congress issued a formal apology recognizing that the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom had been illegal and that Native Hawaiians had never relinquished their sovereignty. The admission confirmed what the historical record already showed. But the apology did not undo the outcome. Land was not returned. Authority was not restored. The acknowledgement arrived without repair. The theft was recognized, but the property remained in the hands of the thief. That is why the story cannot be reduced to a misunderstanding or an accident of history. Hawaii did not drift into the United States. It was taken through a sequence of deliberate actions: economic pressure, political coercion, armed intimidation, and strategic annexation, carried out by identifiable men, protected by state power, and normalized by time. The heist succeeded not because Hawaiians failed to resist, but because resistance was outmatched by leverage and reframed as disorder. What made the theft possible was not chaos in Hawaii, but restraint and the willingness of others to exploit it. By the end, the answer to the title no longer needs to be spoken. The plan was executed, the prize was secured, and the story was rewritten. Hawaii did not choose to give up its sovereignty. It was taken.